All right, Dr. Williams, thank you very much for joining me today. Um, I guess I'll kind of put together a longer, more thorough intro for you later on, but if you don't mind just kind of briefly touching on your background and how you got into regenerative farming.
You bet. So I am a sixth generation family farmer and rancher. My family's been on their land since 1840. And I also spent about 15 years as a university researcher and professor. But I left academia back in the year 2000. So it's been almost a lifetime ago now. And I've been back full time in regenerative farming and ranching since that point. Plus, I'm a founding partner of Understanding Ag, the Soil Health Academy, and Regenified. And through those three companies, we work throughout all of the U.S. and dozens of other countries around the world, helping to promote, advocate, teach, and instruct people in profitable and practical implementation of regenerative principles and practices.
Okay, so what would you define as regenerative principles and practices?
Yeah, so first of all, we define regenerative agriculture as farming and ranching in synchrony with nature to repair, rebuild, revitalize, and restore ecosystem function, starting with life within the soil and then expanding to life above. So that's our definition. Now, in terms of how we accomplish that, we use what we call the 6-3-4, and that is comprised of the six principles of soil health, the three rules of adaptive stewardship, and the four ecosystem processes. So, really, what we're doing is we're teaching people how to apply the principles and rules of regenerative agriculture specifically within their context of their individual farms and ranches so that they can optimize capture of those four ecosystem processes.
Okay, could you, so the 631, would you mind maybe I'm sorry, 634, not 631. Would you mind maybe going through that a little bit, starting with the six, then the three, then the four?
Absolutely. Be very happy to. So we'll start with the six principles of soil health. And the first principle is context. And that's critically important because you can't do anything else appropriately and effectively and efficiently without first applying the other principles within your very specific context. So, context is comprised of a whole bunch of things. It's comprised of your goals and objectives, the history on that farm or ranch, even the what we call the historical ecological context, what happened before what happened before that land was ever even farmed or ranched, what existed there, and even the human dynamics. So the human dynamics part, the interrelationships among family members and with employees, all of that matters quite a bit. And that's all part of context. Then once we define the context, we look at the other five principles so that we can apply them within that context. So the other five principles are: one, minimize disturbance. And that's minimizing disturbance of all kinds. So minimize tillage, minimize chemical and synthetic applications, minimize things like overgrazing if you're a livestock farmer. So we want, in other words, minimize damage that we're doing, right? To
Sure.
the ecosystem, to the soil, to the environment. The next is keep the soil covered or armored at all times. That's another one that's really, really important. And frankly, in today's world, here in the US and globally, there are way, way too many acres that are bare and exposed, for large periods of the year. And that creates a whole host of problems. It exposes that soil to the heat of the sun, it exposes it to wind erosion, water erosion, all of those types of things. The next principle is living roots in the ground at all times. So we really want to keep living plants growing as much of the year as we possibly can, because those living plants and living roots are what feeds the microbes in the soil and in turn signals those microbes to grab nutrients out of the soil profile and feed back to the plants. And those living microbes also produce biotic glues that glue soil particles together, create aggregation for water infiltration and retention. So, living roots in the ground is absolutely a critical component of regenerative agriculture. The next is diversity. We need as much diversity as possible out there. And this is diversity. And if you're in a cropping system, that's diversity in your cash crops, diversity in the cover crops that you're planting in between the cash crops, diversity in your pasture plant species if you're a grazer. It's diversity in the microorganism species in the soil, in beneficial insects and pollinators, birds, and other wildlife, and even in your agricultural enterprises. And then the final principle is integrate livestock back into the system as much as you can. And the reason for that is whenever we can integrate animals back into the system, that's when we see by far the fastest progress. We see, much more rapid progress relative to building soil organic matter, soil carbon, being able to build that microbial population, building the function in the soil, building ecosystems. So all of that matters. So those are the 6 principles of soil health. The next are the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. And they're very simple. They are, number 1, the rule of compounding, which basically means there never are any singular effects in nature. Everything that we do, every decision we make, creates a whole series of compounding, cascading effects. And these effects are never neutral, they're either positive or negative. So the rule of compounding is a rule of recognition. We just simply have to recognize that we're always creating these compounding, cascading effects. And we want to make sure we're implementing management practices that create positive ones rather than negative ones. The second is a rule of diversity. And so here we hear diversity again. It was one of the 6 principles. It's also one of the 3 rules. So that means diversity is really important. And the third rule is the rule of disruption. And what that means is that in nature, nothing is ever static. There's no such thing as sustainable. That's not attainable in real life. Okay. We can't sustain our age, so I get a year older, you get a year older every year if we continue to live.
Right.
We're never going to sustain a certain age, or a certain status in life. That just doesn't happen in real life. So this term sustainable that's been used often for agriculture is actually a huge misappropriation because it's unachievable. There is no such thing as stasis in biology and nature and in farming and ranching. So because of that, the only way that we can move forward on a continuous basis is to introduce what we call planned purposeful disruptions rather than prescriptive approaches. And let me give you an example of this. So let's take a human athlete, for instance. Anybody that's been an athlete knows that to continue to make ongoing progress, you cannot do the same exercise routine at the same duration and intensity day in and day out, year in and year out, and make any progress.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to quickly hit a wall, and then you're going to start going backwards.
Mm-hmm.
So every athlete knows that. So every athlete knows that to continue to make progress, they've got to introduce planned, purposeful disruptions into their exercise routine that challenge body and mind. Well, it's no different. We're biology. If we respond that way, why do we think the biology out here on our farms and ranches responds differently? It does not. So we need to be able to introduce planned, purposeful disruptions out there to make ongoing progress, to create greater resiliency in our systems. And then the reason that we implement the 6 principles and the 3 rules is to optimize capture and function of the 4 ecosystem processes. Those are the four things that have always been free to us and still are free. In agriculture, the price of inputs continues to rise. And over the last several years, they've risen by magnitudes of 2 to 3 to 4 times. But yet, the four ecosystem processes are still there and they're still free to us. And those are number one, energy flow, capture of sunlight, photosynthetic activity that creates energy. So we want to be able to maximize capture of sunlight to be able to optimize photosynthetic activity. Number two is the water cycle. And globally, we have a very broken water cycle. So we need to be able to implement the principles and the rules to fix our water cycle. The third is the mineral cycle. And just like the water cycle, the mineral cycle is all also broken. So we've got to correct that. And then the fourth one, and here is this term again, diversity. So diversity is in the 6 principles. It's in the 3 rules. It's in the 4 ecosystem processes. So that reiterates just how incredibly important diversity is to be able to have fully functioning optimal systems and to be able to maximize net profits for farmers and ranchers.
Got it. I have a question going back to the first of the 6 principles, which is, I believe, context. I heard you in a video, I think this was on the Joyce Farms website. You referred to the land that was. Would that be a part of the context of your specific region or farmland? And are you trying to mimic the historical land that was, essentially, with your farming practices?
Yeah, so when I talk about the land that was, I'm talking about what we call the historical ecological context. And that is very important because it's only when we understand what the land once was that we can begin to understand what the land can once again be. That is what unveils for us the true potential for that land, to be able to tap back into the abundance and the diversity and the function that once was there. And we have found that maybe we can't achieve fully, what was once there 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or so forth. But what we absolutely have found is that we can make incredible progress once we understand that. The other thing that we have found is that there is still, in almost every area in North America, there is still an incredibly vibrant, latent seed bank that exists, and that we can tap back in to that seed bank. So we are doing that and making quite a bit of progress in doing so.
Gotcha. It's interesting. When I was in college, I had a friend who worked at this organization where they would kind of maintain areas of land that had never been farmed, never been developed. So it was a lot of like smaller plots of land, like cemeteries that had been there for 200 plus years, and then also some forest areas that just weren't able to be developed or farmed. And it was interesting the difference in the types of plants you would see in those areas. Like I'm in central Illinois, and I remember seeing an orchid in one of those places, which I had no idea Illinois would have a plant like that. So it's interesting. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. It is interesting.
That's exactly what we're seeing. Yeah.
So I have a question. So a few of the things I read about you, is that you kind of pioneered a lot of these practices that are being put into place, in regenerative farming. Would the whole rotational grazing, like the small paddocks where you move cattle frequently and livestock, is that something that you came up with, or is that something you expanded on?
Well, it's something I expanded on. There's been many who have worked on this that you could give credit to through the decades, and certainly one of those would be my partner Gabe Brown. And there's many others I could name. Uh, Alan Savory, Greg Judy, Jim Garish, and I could keep going on and on. I'm going to leave out a lot of them if I start naming everybody,
Sure.
and I know that. But basically, what what I did was I uh, looked at the body of knowledge that we had, and then looked at how do I apply that within my context, and then how do we improve on that, and then since then there have been researchers such as Dr. Richard Teague, Dr. Jason Roundtree, and a number of others who have done some really seminal research relative to what we today called adaptive grazing, and some call it AMP or adaptive multi-paddock grazing. Uh, but the bottom line is this: what we have discovered, no doubt, is that prescriptive grazing never works long term. You always hit a wall, just like doing the same exercise routine over and over again, right? And so with adaptive grazing, it's designed specifically to avoid finding yourself doing the same thing over and over again. And that's why we have the rule of disruption. The rule of disruption is specifically designed to help us be able to avoid becoming prescriptive, which is human nature, and to instead consistently change things up. So I've been doing what I now call adaptive grazing. We didn't call it this in the 1990s when I first started doing it, but that's what we call it now. I first started doing this in the 1990s, and I have found very definitively over the last 30 years that it is critically important that we continue to change things up and avoid being prescriptive. And if we do that and we adapt to the ever changing conditions that we have out there, we will make ongoing progress. So, in doing this for 30 years now, I have not hit a wall. Okay. We continue after 30 plus years to make progress in building soil, building diversity, building function, building profitability.
Gotcha. Soil is something that seems foundational in the not just obviously not just the principles of regenerative agriculture, but kind of just in agriculture in general. How did we get to the point where our soils don't seem to be soil, but more of just a substrate to grow plants in, if that makes sense? We don't really like, I live in central Illinois. I'm surrounded by cornfields that all the nutrients come from the inputs. How did we get to that point? How did we get to the point of conventional monocropping agriculture and away from this more, I don't know if you call it natural, more synchronous way of farming?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and actually there's a lot of story behind that. Uh, but the first thing that I'll say in response to that question is this: we forgot that the soil is alive. And over the last several decades, we have pretty much treated the soil like it was just simply an inert chemistry set. And that all we need to deal with is the chemistry in the soil, and we're good to go. Um, and so that's one of the things that has occurred. Just simply forgetting and ignoring the biology in the soil and how that biology functioned for millennia. Yeah. So for a very long time, but if we really want to go back and look at the history of this and what occurred, the major shift in agriculture occurred when we started with the land rushes, okay, approximately 50 years after we started the land rush, we had the Dust Bowl of the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And the ironic thing about this is that the Dust Bowl wasn't created by massive tillage equipment that we have today. It was created by people plowing with single tree plows pulled by an animal, a mule, a horse, an oxen.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we created the Dust Bowl. The other ironic thing is that every one of those farmers that created the Dust Bowl, by today's NOP standards, National Organic Program standards, would have been a certified organic farmer. They would have qualified as a certified organic farmer because they didn't use any chemicals. They didn't use any synthetics. None of that was there at that point in time. So they would have been an organic farmer by today's standards. But yet we created the Dust Bowl. So then we followed that up with World War II. And in World War I and World War II, the government contracted with companies to produce chemicals for warfare and to produce nitrates and phosphates for making ordnance, bombs, all of that. Well, immediately following World War II, our government thought, well, we just had a World War I and a World War II. We could have a World War III. So they said, we want to keep these companies around because we may need these chemicals and we may need these nitrates and phosphates yet again for warfare. So the ironic thing is that all of those companies were not agricultural companies. They were companies supplying the Department of Defense. But the government turned them into agricultural companies. The government said, well, we got to keep you alive. We got to do something to keep this going. So let's encourage the farmer to apply your chemicals and to use these nitrates and phosphates. And so there was a huge push by the federal government and the USDA at that time to do exactly that. And because we had just come through the Dust Bowl, well, guess what? The nitrates and phosphates appeared to be miracles because we had seriously depleted our soils. And now all of a sudden, by applying something over the top, we could get things to grow again. And that caused a radical shift in the way farmers thought and acted. And it caused a radical shift in the research that was being done by our universities and our USDA ARS. And you can even look at the research journals pre and post World War II and see this very clearly. Pre-World War II, a lot of the peer-reviewed published research in all of our major agricultural journals was very much oriented to the regenerative principles and practices that we're now once again teaching.
That is interesting that there would be that big of a difference pre and post, that you could just see, that you can see it in the research. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it's crystal clear, again, when you go into the journals. But post-World War II, all of the research suddenly shifted to research looking at, okay, what happens when we apply this much chemical or this type of chemical? What happens when we apply this much NPK? On and on and on, right? And that's what all the research became. And then we designed a soil test to look only at soil chemistry and not biology. And a soil test that basically all it did was say, you have this much NPK and elements, and you need to add this much. And that evolved through that. So that's what happened. And over the last 8 decades or so since World War II, it has not shifted back yet. You know, all the research, all the farm and ranch practices, everything are all the USDA recommendations pretty much are still focused on that concept, that mindset. And along the way, though, what we have discovered is that we have, again, I'll come back to the fact that we have totally ignored soil biology and the function of biology in the soil. We have totally ignored uh, diversity, yeah, and the function that diversity plays. And all the research, see, it was super easy to do research and to figure out how to apply chemicals and fertilizer with monocrops than it was to do this with diverse cropping systems and diverse pasture systems. So, because of that, all of the research relative to development of our cropping systems, our pasture systems, everything else became oriented towards the chemical and fertilizer industries and satisfying them because again the government wanted to keep them around. So that's really in a nutshell what has happened. And because of that, we have experienced incredible loss of topsoil, of biology in the soil, of soil aggregation, ability of soil to infiltrate and hold water. We've lost all of that. And if you look over the last decade, we have had a return of massive dust storms of the same magnitude that we saw in the 1930s Dust Bowl. They are once again occurring. Starting at about 2010, 2011, we have had massive dust storms somewhere in the U.S. every single year.
Wow.
Last year, there was a massive dust storm in the state of Illinois that caused a massive vehicle pileup on the interstate. And actually, a number of people died as a result of that. And we also had, I forget the number, but 3 dozen plus injured, in this pileup because nobody could see because of the dust storm. So we're once again seeing things like that occurring. And you're right. You made a statement earlier. It seems like today we're farming substrate, subsoil, and not real topsoil. And that is absolutely true. We have lost a huge amount of our original topsoil. And in many areas of the U.S., we are literally farming now B horizon soil because the original A horizon soil has been lost to wind and water erosion.
What is A horizon and B horizon soil?
Well, A horizon is what we would typically refer to as topsoil.
Okay.
The original topsoil, right? B horizon is the profile of soil that exists up underneath that topsoil layer. And again, we've lost a lot of that A horizon. And even on my family's farm, like I said, they've been farming it since the 1840s. That was in the South, and they, for decades, it grew a lot of cotton, and cotton is highly destructive. They did a lot of tillage, did a lot of plowing to grow that cotton, and I never realized it, but the entire time I was growing up on my family's farm, we were farming B horizon, not A horizon. The A horizon was long gone before I was even born.
And the way that you build that A horizon soil back is through the 6, 3, 4 principles of regenerative farming. You graze the livestock on the land, they fertilize the soil, and then it's like a circular type thing. As far as and I've heard you say before when I was kind of looking to this. I've heard you say the thing about the second Dust Bowl. I've never heard anyone say that. I've never heard a news story about it. Is it just not that big of an issue, or is it something people just aren't talking about? Is it something that people don't want to talk about? Are we digging our heads in the dust?
So it is something people don't want to talk about, is what it boils down to. Now, is there recognition and growing recognition of this? Yes, there is. And like I said, the Illinois dust storm that I mentioned that created that massive pileup on the interstate and loss of life and injury and all of that, that was heavily in the news and talked about quite a bit. So the recognition is there, it's coming, but let's go back to the original Dust Bowl. The same thing happened. Even though there were these massive, massive dust storms going on and all of this, and farmers losing everything and having to move, to, the novel Grapes of Wrath, was based on that. So, even though all of that was occurring, it was virtually being ignored by Congress, being ignored in Washington, and nothing was really being done about it. So very similar to today. Okay. And if you remember the story, it wasn't until one of those dust clouds actually enveloped Washington, D.C., that Congress finally said, oh, maybe this is a real thing.
Right.
Maybe we do need to pay attention and do something about this. So, the same thing happened in the 1930s in terms of, the figuratively and, and in the 1930s, probably there was a lot of literally burying heads in the sand, but the same thing is happening today. And it's not something that politically a lot of people want to talk about, because politically it would admit failure, right?
Sure.
That all the conservation practices we have told you we have supported over the last several decades and that we are promoting and that we are spending your taxpayer dollars on, maybe they're not working nearly as well as we thought. And nobody wants to admit that.
What was originally done? How was the first Dust Bowl resolved?
Well, that's when we had, the significant conservation practices put into play. And farmers were encouraged to plant a lot of cover crops. So here we go. Okay.
Sure. Gotcha.
So we look at, almost a century ago, they were being encouraged to plant cover crops, to have greater, cash crop species diversity in their rotations. They were being encouraged to be, at that time, they were encouraging them to, on slope land that they were farming, to build terraces, to capture water and slow down water, to do a better job of tillage practices and minimize disturbance through tillage. So, ironically, a lot of the things that we're now once again talking about today were talked about then and implemented then, and farmers were encouraged to implement those practices then. And they did for a little while. Okay. But again, when all of a sudden you have all of these synthetic fertilizers that you can just buy and apply and make things grow, and you have all of these chemicals that allow you to control weeds and control this and that, control fungal pathogens, control pest insects, all of these types of things, it made the job easier, for the farmer. And then during that same time period, we developed massive equipment. So now farmers started going the other way again. They didn't want buffer strips. They didn't want terraces. They didn't want, conservation practices anymore because it got in their way. And instead, it became, let's rip up all the fence rows. Let's rip up all the tree lines, because we've got much larger equipment. And oh, by the way, we're being told we have to feed the world. Uh, so we need to be able to blow and go. We don't want any impedance. We want our fields as large as possible with no impedance, just these wide open fields so we can run our massive equipment through there and literally plow and plant, ditch to ditch, road to road,
Mm-hmm.
which, and in many areas, we're still seeing that same philosophy being implemented today. Now, are there some farmers doing things differently? Yes, and I applaud them, but there's still way too many that are still in that mindset of, I've got to plow and plant every possible acre I can. Yeah, and so really, and we've had policies and practices that have almost encouraged that type of thing as well over the last several decades. So we started implementing conservation practices, and then we gradually worked our way back out of those and into the situation that we once again find ourselves in today.
Well, what's interesting, if I'm following this timeline correctly, is so the Dust Bowl happened in the 30s.
Yeah.
And to mitigate that, we returned to some more regenerative type practices. And then
Yep.
World War II would have ended late 40s.
Yeah, 45.
And that's when we kind of switched back to more conventional farming. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that if we mitigated the effects of the Dust Bowl in essentially a decade, it seems like it doesn't take long for these practices to really start healing the land, is I guess the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, so that's absolutely true. So, one of the things that we have definitively discovered is the timeline for making significant progress with regenerative principles and practices is we've now got that timeline down to 3 to 4 years. We can make remarkable progress in building soil, building aggregate, building soil function and biology, building diversity in just 3 to 4 years. And we have the data to show that over and over and over again, farm after farm after farm. And not just here in the US, but in many other countries around the world. So, yes, we can make rather remarkable progress but the key here is tapping back into the existing biology in the soil. We're not going to make that progress through chemical applications, through synthetic fertility applications, and those types of things. So the things that we've been focused on over the last 8 decades are not the things that allow us to make that progress. Synthetic fertilizers and chemicals do not build soil biology. They do not build soil. They don't build soil aggregation. They don't build any of that. Only biology can do that. So it is clearly the ability to tap back into biology and biological functioning that is the key here. And that is what allows us to be able to make this remarkable progress that we're once again making.
Gotcha. Do you think that we needed conventional farming the way that we've been doing it for the last 80 years? Because obviously hindsight's 2020 and we can look back and say, oh, we should have done this and that and this, but we fed the world through this huge population boom through these practices. Did we need conventional farming? Is there anything redeeming about it?
So the short answer is, can we, quote, feed the world? And honestly, look, we probably need to talk about that statement a little bit. Okay.
Okay, fair enough.
But before I dive into that, can we, quote, feed the world by farming and ranching regeneratively? Oh, yes. And many times over. Many times over. Okay. So, that's often the argument that you hear is that, well, this regenerative stuff is well and good, but the truth is we can't feed the world through regenerative. Well, oh, yeah, we can. Because the truth is, we're not going to continue to feed the world through conventional agriculture. It's already failing us, and it will continue to fail us even more. So, the only way to really feed the world as we continue down our path is through significant implementation of regenerative principles and practices. Now, let me go back just briefly to this feed the world statement. First of all, American farmers and ranchers do not feed the world. Okay, we don't. We don't. And if we think we do, we're lying to ourselves. There's other countries that are outproducing us. Okay, and I mean, when we look now at the corn and beans and things like that are being grown in countries like Brazil and Argentina, and many other countries around the world, Eastern European countries and so forth, we're being outstretched by other countries now. So this concept that American farmers feed the world, no, we don't. And then you look at the amount of food that we're importing, okay, from other countries. So wait a minute, if we're feeding the world, why are we importing foods? Both grains, proteins, everything else from other countries ourselves. Now, I know what a lot of people will say to that state. Well, that's because of trade. We got to have this equal trade and all of this. But the fact of the matter is, we're importing a lot of food. So that is going on as well. Now, what about the corn and soybeans that we're growing? Now, we don't eat those directly, or the majority of the corn and soy. Nobody sits down to a bowl of or a plate of field corn or field soybeans for dinner.
Right.
The only way we consume those is through processed food products, those items going into something else that we consume. But the vast majority of the corn, especially grown in the U.S., where does it go? What is it used for? It's used for livestock feeds, many different species of livestock, and it's used for ethanol production and those types of things. So, that's the reality of the situation. Now we can say, okay, but the livestock feed us. Okay. Yeah. But what I will say is that, we actually don't need those grains, grown to the degree that we're growing them today to feed all of our livestock, to feed us. And we've proven that as well. So again, we don't feed the world. We may do our part in that regard, but we don't feed the whole world, and the whole world is not dependent on us and never will be again. So it's more incumbent upon us to let's get our agriculture right. Let's get it fixed, the problems that we have currently fixed, so that we can fix our ecosystems, our environment, our climate, and our human health issues. And oh, by the way, let's fix our farm profitability. Okay. That is very, very important. So we need to fix this farm profitability issue because way too many of our farmers and ranchers are deep in debt, very deep in debt, to the point that we have a high level of depression and anxiety among the farming and ranching community, and to the point that, farming is now among the top 3 professions for suicide. That's where we're at in reality.
Yeah, the people that produce our food. It's a little backwards. I wanted to switch gears a little bit. There's a case study. I think I found this on the Understanding Ag website. This is a ranch in Las Damas, Chihuahua, Mexico. Are you familiar with the ranch? What's interesting about this one is and you mentioned the words repair, rebuild, and what is it, rejuvenate as principles of regenerative agriculture. And I think this really goes beyond that because essentially, if I'm reading it correctly, you, you took. Were you directly involved in this particular case study?
So we have had quite a bit of involvement with that and quite a few others. And what we have clearly found is that you can, and yes, we did that case study, and published that case study. Uh, what we have clearly found is that we can restore the desert. Um, and what we are calling the desert in that case, that's the Chihuahuan Desert. What we are calling the desert wasn't always a desert as it looks today. Again, the historical ecological context, that entire country of what today comprises the Chihuahuan Desert once was a thriving grassland, a grassland that was vibrant and supported a lot of bison, elk, antelope, deer. There were even once a lot of beaver and otter there, which meant what? There was water there.
Hmm.
You know, so it wasn't the desert as we envision it today. It was very, very different. And what we have found is that when we implement the 634 in that desert environment, then we can return it to its former state. And we can return it to a highly functioning sea of grass. And that's what you see with the Los Damas Ranch. And again, there's many others down there that have done the same thing. The Los Damas is Alejandro Correa's ranch. Another that has made absolutely remarkable progress is, the Santa Maria Ranch that's owned by Fernando Folomir and his family. Uh, Others would include Tavo Bermudez, Jesus, and Juan Pablo Almeida, and I could continue to name those that are implementing the 634 and have made radical differences on the landscape in the desert.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating to me because, again, you're not talking about restoring land that was depleted due to poor management processes. You're essentially talking about terraforming the desert in a way that's profitable to the landowner, and I think the implications of that are just pretty incredible. What else do I got? Okay, so efficiency, we've already kind of touched on this essentially. My question is about affordability of conventionally grown foods versus regeneratively. Obviously, regenerative comes at a premium because it's a premium product. Is it also true that the conventional foods we find in the grocery stores are artificially, the prices are artificially low due to subsidies or externalized costs of conventional agriculture? How do you convince people to make the switch over to foods that have been grown regeneratively when they can get this cheaper food at the grocery store, which, by the way, is getting less and less cheap very quickly? Maybe that's a separate issue.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot to unpack there.
Sure.
We could have a whole separate session on just that alone. But to begin to address that, first and foremost, yes, all the foods that we would consider commodity foods, just the conventionally produced foods in our grocery stores and in our restaurants, yes, that production is pretty heavily subsidized by our taxpayer dollars. So we are paying more than you realize for it, just maybe not in direct food purchase, but through your taxes. Okay. The farm bill, the last farm bill was a more than $800 billion bill.
Wow.
And the current farm bill that that is being bantered about in Congress. They haven't passed it yet, but it's being bantered about, and it's got to be passed here sooner or later. They're proposing 1.2 to 1.3 trillion plus dollars in that farm bill. Okay. So, yeah, we have incredible subsidy in agriculture that so you're still paying an expensive price one way or the other, whether you realize it or not. No food is really cheap, and it's impossible for it to be truly cheap. The second thing is that when you put foods on a true pound to pound basis, so let's do apples to apples comparison. Okay, what do a lot of these foods really cost you that you're eating on a per pound basis? So if you go to the grocery store and you look at the cost per pound for potato chips, for instance, do you realize that a pound of potato chips, you never buy them by the pound, you buy them by the package, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you put it on a pound per pound basis, like you should as a consumer, do you realize you're paying anywhere from $5 to over $20 per pound for potato chips?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at most of the cereals that people are buying, the breakfast cereals, they're paying anywhere from, again, about $4 a pound to well over $20 a pound for the breakfast cereals that they're buying. If you look at, a lot of people in the grocery store and truck stops, convenience stores are buying, all of these snack sticks and jerkies and things like that, and those are made out of commodity meats. But when you look at, the price per pound, you're paying anywhere from $20 to over $50 a pound for those jerkies and snack sticks that you're routinely buying.
Right.
So is food really cheap? No, not at all. Now let's go to fast food. Okay. And let's talk about that. So, and as you know, the price of fast food over the last year has radically risen.
Right.
But let's take a quarter pounder as an example. Okay. It's got a quarter of a pound of beef in it, right? So when you put that on a per pound basis, okay, on a per pound basis, that quarter pounder is actually that if you bought 4 of them to equal a pound of beef, okay, that has now cost you over $15 a pound for that beef on that quarter pounder. Look at a Taco Bell taco, over $22 a pound. Okay.
I'm not sure that that's even beef.
Yeah, and I would agree with that.
Yeah.
It's a meat-like substance.
But I
And
get your
then,
point.
yeah, in a Chick-fil-A sandwich, over $20 a pound.
Wow.
So again, what we perceive as cheap food is absolutely not cheap. And so my contention is, yeah, we sell our 100% grass-fed beef that we have actual phytonutrient data on, for it for $8 a pound all day long. Okay. So that's cheaper than a pound of beef going to McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, any of these other places. So why would you not rather buy a beef that you know exactly how it was produced? You can even know the farmer that produced it. You can know the land that it was produced on. You can have assurances and trust. And by the way, we can provide the actual phytonutrient profile of that end product to show you that it is a very healthy product, and has substantially more phytonutrient richness than the commodity produced beef. And we've got the data to prove that. So as a consumer, what choice would you rather make? And then the final thing we want to look at here is the cheap food and the highly processed foods have also cost us significantly in our human health. What is the price of health care today? So if we add in the price of health care, we find that cheap food is not cheap at all. It's actually incredibly expensive.
Okay. So, kind of building off of you mentioned if when you buy local, you can know the farmer, you can know the nutrient profiles of the beef. That makes me wonder if I'm in the grocery store and I see a steak or a pound of ground beef that says, grass fed or organic or whatever the label might be. Does that, I mean, that's a USDA approved label, right? They've gone through whatever um, requirements they had to do to put that marketing label on their food. Does it mean anything when I buy grass fed beef from the grocery store, or can I trust that beef in the grocery store to actually be? Do you get what I'm trying to get at?
Yeah.
Like, how honest
So,
do they have to be in their practices if I'm just buying it at the grocery
yeah.
store?
Yeah. So, if it's certified organic, then that does mean that it had to meet USDA NOP standards, to receive that label, right? That certified organic label. Now, if it says certified organic, then there's a number of things it may not be telling you. So you would have to look on the label and see, was that certified organic grain fed or certified organic grass fed, right? So just certified organic doesn't tell you whether it was finished on grain or finished on grass. That will be an additional label requirement to be able to determine that. The other thing that it doesn't tell you is the phytonutrient profile. So you really don't have any clue what the phytonutrient profile is in that product. And it can be radically different, okay? Even though it's certified organic, that phytonutrient profile can be wildly different. So what you do know is that it was produced under organic standards. What you don't know, unless there's additional label claims, USDA FSIS approved label claims, is whether it was grain fed or grass fed, or again, the phytonutrient richness. Those are the things you don't know, and you probably also will not know who produced it, where it was produced, what region of the country, or if it was even an imported product. Because right now, imported meats can have the label product of USA legally put on them. And the consumer automatically thinks, well, that was produced by USA farmer or rancher. But no, as a matter of fact, right now, any meat product that has product of USA on it, you're almost guaranteed that is an imported product.
Wow.
Now that is being rescinded, but that's not going to happen until January of 2026. That you no longer can label imported beef with product of USA on it.
Really?
So we still have almost 2 years to go of the consumer seeing that and thinking that that was produced by American farmers and ranchers.
So at the end of the day, your best bet is to purchase as much food as you can locally from people you know or that are just in your community.
Either do that or, you know, study the branded programs that are out there and that are offering, branded proteins and other food products through the grocery stores. Really study them and learn whether what they're doing. Are they sourcing product from U.S. farmers and ranchers? Are they looking at the phytonutrient profile in those end products and publishing that data and things like that? So, as a consumer, we also have a responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
to learn more about how our foods are produced and the trustworthiness of those foods. So we bear a responsibility as well, and we should not just place that responsibility solely on the farmer and rancher.
Yeah, absolutely fair. So the nutritive differences between grass fed and grain fed, which is what I originally reached out to you for. and then got sidetracked by all the regenerative stuff. But I'd still really like to talk about that. What are sort of maybe the main differences between grass fed and grain fed, and maybe yeah, let's stick with that for now. Stick with that for now.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to qualify that just a little further.
Sure.
Okay. So, what I'm going to be talking about here, and again, we can have another session where we really dive deep into the data here because we do have quite a bit of data, okay, from actual research that we can talk about. But for the sake of time today, what I'll say is that the whether it's grass fed or grain fed, even if it's grass fed on the farms that are doing grass fed, the health of their soil and the diversity of their pastures matters. So the lower the health of the soil, the lower the diversity of the pastures. Even if it's grass fed, the lower that phytonutrient profile is going to be. Now it's still going to be better than the phytonutrient profile of grain fed beef. Okay, period. That's just, there's no getting around that, and all our data clearly shows that. But there are also differences among grass-fed producers, just like there are differences among feedlots. The nutritional profile of beef, for instance, coming out of all feedlots is not the same. It's pretty darn variable if you actually did the analysis on it. The problem is they don't. Okay. They just do a generic nutritional panel for most foods, even though they can vary wildly. So here are the principal differences. So the fatty acid profile, omega 3s, CLAs, omega 6 to 3 ratio, all of that are significantly better in foods that are produced regeneratively, particularly the proteins. Okay. The grass fed beef, the pastured lamb, the pastured pork, pastured eggs, all of that. So no doubt that fatty acid profile is a lot more favorable. In the omega 6 to 3 ratio is very similar to what we would find in wild caught salmon and tuna. Okay. So it's very, very good. So we have a really good fatty acid profile that's favorable for brain health, heart health, all of that. The next is the vitamin and mineral profile, significantly better in animals that are raised on pasture, in diverse pastures, and on healthy soil versus animals in a CAFO situation. So significantly better in vitamin and mineral profile. The third is this whole phytonutrient complex. And phytonutrients are very powerful antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. And where does every disease and disorder and malady known to man start with inflammation in the body? So if we can eat foods that are rich in phytonutrients, then we're consuming a lot of anti-inflammatories and antioxidants. So that's incredibly healthy for us. And what we are finding is that these foods produced regeneratively are averaging anywhere from 50% to over 400% higher in individual phytonutrients compared to foods that are produced more conventionally. So again, we've got the data and we're continuing to build this data set, and it is very revealing.
Okay. Well, I have one more question for you, if you don't mind, before I let you go, and that is, so people who take the stance that grain fed and grass fed aren't that much different. First off, they never address the phytochemicals, they never address the vitamins and minerals, at least from the arguments I've heard. What they tend to focus on, and you in your book, Before You Have a Cow, you addressed this in the last chapter. Someone wrote an article essentially saying, yeah, there's a little bit more omega 3, but I mean, have you seen how much is in salmon? I mean, it's not that big of a difference. Because people seem to focus on the fatty acid profiles in the omega 3s versus the 6s, is it that big of a difference? How much omega 3s? Is it more about the ratios? Where are people coming from when they make that criticism?
Yeah, so first of all, they're wrong. Okay, there is a big difference. statistically highly significant. And we've shown that over the data shows that over and over and over again. So when they say, well, this is minuscule, no, absolutely it's not minuscule. And here's the deal. On any nutrient that we eat, any nutrient that we're eating, it's not the nutrients that you eat in a single day that matter. It's the lifetime accumulation, the day after day, week after week, year after year accumulation of those nutrients in our body that matters. So I could say, well, salmon has a lot more omega-3 than grass-fed beef on a per gram basis, but yet who eats wild-caught salmon every day?
Right.
No one, no one, no one. Most people eat salmon a handful of times a year. Well, it doesn't matter how much omega-3 is in salmon. It's not doing them any good because they're not eating it often enough. And oh, by the way, farm salmon is greatly diminished in that regard compared to wild-caught salmon. Okay. So it's not the same. And more people are eating the farm fish, so they're not getting the same, fatty acid benefits out of that. So it's the cumulative effect. So if I'm eating beef or pork or eggs or whatever that have a much more favorable fatty acid profile week after week after week, year after year, that is hugely meaningful, and I am building my health over and over again. So that is what we want to achieve and what we want to do. Now, the second thing that I'll say is what is also critical is our daily consumption of omega-6 to omega-3. That ratio is critically important in our diet. And unfortunately, the average American today in their diet is consuming an omega-6 to 3 ratio that's 20 to 1 or higher. That's not very good. Too much omega-6s create a lot of inflammation in our bodies. And of course, that leads to disease, disorders, all of that. So we've got to really pay attention to this omega-6 to 3 ratio. Our research is showing that on the omega-6s in a lot of our grain-fed beefs, it's anywhere from 11 to 1 to over 50 to 1. Now, that's a pretty wide range. Why? Because of what they're fed in the feedlot. All feedlot rations are not the same. They vary wildly. And one of the things we have discovered in our research is that when these rations include dried distillers grains, what we call DDGs, the byproduct of ethanol production, that radically increases omega-6s. So in those animals, we are seeing omega-6 to 3 ratios of anywhere from 30 to 1 to over 50 to 1. Now, that is a product that will create a lot of inflammation in our bodies. And that's not good for us, eating that routinely. So that's where we're at. And so it's on whether we're talking about vitamins, minerals, fatty acids, or phytonutrients. It's never what you're eating in a single meal. If you want to compare single meal to single meal, that's utterly and wholly irrelevant. And any scientist really knows that. And for them to but I've heard scientists make that argument. They're doing a single meal to single meal comparison. And you might as well throw that out the window. It's meaningless. It is how are we eating day in and day out, year in and year out that matters.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time today. I very much appreciate it. You sitting down with me.
You are most welcome.
All right. I'm going to stop the recording.